My father stood in front of the judge, straightened his tie, and said the words like he'd rehearsed them 100 times in the mirror. My child is mentally incompetent and incapable of managing money. The courtroom went quiet in that particular way rooms go quiet when everyone in them believes they already know how the story ends. A few heads nodded. My stepmother dabbed at dry eyes with a tissue she didn't need. My half-siblings sat with their hands folded, faces arranged into practiced sympathy. I sat at the defense table and felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Calm. The judge, an older woman with silver hair pulled back tight and reading glasses perched low on her nose, looked at my father for a long moment. She didn't write anything down. She didn't glance at her notes. She simply asked one question in a voice so quiet the court reporter had to ask her to repeat it. My father's face went the color of old paper. Everything that happened after that came fast. Faster than I could have imagined 60 seconds changing a person's life, but that's exactly what happened. Let me back up. My name doesn't matter for this story, so I'll just tell you who I was in that courtroom. 31 years old, a senior operations manager at a logistics company I'd worked my way up in since I was 22. A homeowner, someone with a credit score in the 700s and 80s and not so much as a parking ticket to my name. I'd never been arrested, never missed a mortgage payment, never bounced a check. My mother died when I was 19. Cancer, slow and cruel, the kind that gives you time to say goodbye and steals your peace of mind while it does it. I won't pretend the grief didn't break something in me for a while. It did. I struggled with anxiety in my early 20s, the kind that keeps you up at 3 a.m. convinced the walls are closer than they were an hour ago. I went to therapy. I took medication for 2 years, tapered off under a doctor's supervision, and came out the other side stronger than I'd ever been. That's what therapy is supposed to do. That's what it did for me. My father remarried when I was 22. I didn't hate my stepmother, not at first. I just watched her, slowly and methodically, insert herself into every financial conversation in the family until my father stopped making decisions without her in the room. I watched the family accounts I used to have visibility into get quietly restructured. I watched invitations to holidays get smaller. I felt the distance grow inch by inch, the way you don't notice a tide coming in until you look down and your feet are already wet. I told myself it was just how families change. I didn't know it was something else. My grandparents, my mother's parents, had built a modest fortune over a lifetime of hard, unglamorous work. A hardware store that became 3 hardware stores. Real estate bought slow and sold smart. When they passed, they left a trust behind for me, their only grandchild, to be released in full when I turned 32. Until then, my father was named trustee, tasked with managing and protecting it. I turned 31 that spring. The trust was set to dissolve into my name in 11 months. That's when the petition arrived at my door, delivered by a process server who wouldn't meet my eyes. My father was asking the court to declare me mentally incompetent. He wanted permanent conservatorship over my inheritance. Not temporary oversight, not a delay, but permanent control indefinitely of money that wasn't his. I remember standing in my kitchen holding those papers, reading the word incompetent attached to my name, and feeling something crack open in my chest that had nothing to do with anger. It was grief, a different kind than I'd felt when my mother died. This was the grief of realizing the person who was supposed to protect you had decided, instead, to profit from you. The weeks before the hearing were a slow unveiling of just how far he was willing to go. He hired a lawyer who specialized in conservatorship cases and handed over everything he could find. Old therapy records from a decade earlier, a list of anxiety medications I hadn't touched in years, text messages stripped of context, a message where I'd once written, "I feel like I'm losing my mind," during finals week in college, presented in his filing as though it were a diagnosis. Emails edited to remove the sentences before and after the ones that made me sound unstable. He lined up witnesses. My stepmother took the stand first, her voice trembling with what looked, to anyone who didn't know her, like genuine heartbreak. She described me as erratic, impulsive, prone to disappearing for days, none of which was true, but delivered with enough conviction that I watched 2 jurors' worth of spectators in the gallery nod along. My half-siblings, teenagers who'd grown up hearing their father's version of me and nothing else, testified next. They weren't lying. Not exactly. They were repeating a story that had been told to them so many times it had become their own memory. The way a photograph copied over and over eventually loses its sharpness but keeps its shape. My father's attorney painted a picture of a fragile, unstable young adult who couldn't be trusted with a checkbook, let alone a 7-figure inheritance. He brought up my mother's death like it was evidence of a permanent fracture rather than a wound that had healed the way wounds do, with time, effort, and scar tissue that made me stronger in the broken places. I sat there and let him talk. My attorney, a sharp, unhurried woman named Renata, who'd taken my case after one meeting and a look at my bank statements, kept telling me the same thing. Let him build the house. We're going to show the judge what it's built on. On paper, my life told a very different story than the one my father's lawyer was selling. I'd graduated college with honors while working 2 part-time jobs to help cover my mother's medical bills before she passed. I'd been promoted 3 times in 8 years at the same company. I owned a modest 3-bedroom home I'd bought at 28 with a conventional loan and a 20% down payment I'd saved myself, dollar by dollar. I had a retirement account I contributed to every month without fail. I'd been in a stable relationship for 4 years with someone who, when asked to testify, described me as the most reliable person I have ever met, a phrase that made my father's attorney visibly wince. I had no criminal record, not even a speeding ticket in 6 years. My therapist from years earlier, when subpoenaed, testified that I had completed treatment successfully, had been discharged with no ongoing diagnosis, and had, in her clinical opinion, handled a profound loss with more resilience and self-awareness than most adults twice her age. None of it seemed to matter in the moment. My father's team kept talking. The gallery kept nodding. My father, watching his narrative take hold, began to relax in his chair, the posture of a man who believed the verdict was already written. I watched him lean over and whisper something to my stepmother. She smiled. Then the judge looked up from her notes. She'd been quiet for most of the proceedings, letting both attorneys speak, occasionally asking a clarifying question, giving no indication of where her thinking stood. But something in my father's confidence seemed to catch her attention, the way a hairline crack catches the light right before the whole pane gives way. "Mr." she said, using my father's name. "I have a question before we continue with character testimony." The room settled. "Who has been managing the trust funds for the past 10 years? My father answered without hesitation, the way you answer a question you assume is a formality. "I have, Your Honor, as trustee." The judge nodded slowly, took off her glasses, and set them down on the bench in front of her. "Then can you explain to me," she said, "why over $900,000 is unaccounted for in the trust's financial records?" The courtroom didn't gasp so much as it seemed to stop breathing all at once. I watched my father's mouth open and nothing come out. I watched my stepmother's hand, which had been resting on his arm in a show of support, go still and then quietly withdraw. Renata rose to her feet. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, we'd like to enter into evidence the financial records my client's forensic accountant compiled over the last 4 months." What followed was the part of the hearing that would end up, eventually, retold at family gatherings I would never attend, in a hush reserved for stories people can't quite believe actually happened to someone they knew. Bank statements showing wire transfers from the trust account into a personal account held jointly by my father and stepmother. A down payment on a lake house paid in full, in cash, the same year the trust's annual report claimed modest administrative withdrawals. 2 luxury vacations, one to the Amalfi Coast, one a 2-week safari, both charged directly to a trust-linked credit card. A brand new SUV, purchased outright, registered in my stepmother's name 3 months after the trust's reported balance mysteriously dropped by $60,000. The lease deposit and first 18 months of rent for my stepmother's boutique, a business that had never turned a profit and existed, as far as Renata's investigator could determine, mostly as a line item to justify recurring withdrawals. Casino statements showing repeated cash advances my father had pulled using a card linked to the trust, totaling nearly $80,000 over 3 years. A full kitchen and master bathroom renovation on the family home, paid for with 2 separate transfers labeled, in the trust's own internal documentation, as beneficiary medical support. A description that would have been almost funny if it weren't so cruel, given that I had never received a cent of it. Renata laid it all out slide by slide, document by document, calm and unhurried, the way you'd walk someone through a house you already knew was on fire. My father tried to recover. That's the part I'll never forget. Watching a person who had spent months building a case about my instability suddenly become the most unstable person in the room. He blamed his accountant, said the man had made aggressive investment choices without his full knowledge. When Renata produced emails showing my father personally authorizing several of the largest transfers, he pivoted, said he'd been advised the withdrawals were legal trustee compensation. When she pointed out that trustee compensation had never been disclosed or approved by the court as required, he said he didn't remember the specifics, a phrase that came out of his mouth 4 more times in the next 10 minutes. Each new answer contradicted something he'd said earlier under oath. The judge noticed. She began writing again, this time steadily, her pen not stopping. The forensic accountant took the stand next, a soft-spoken man named Delgado who spoke about spreadsheets the way other people talk about crime scenes, precise, unemotional, devastating. He testified to 2 signatures on trust disbursement forms that did not match any known signature sample from me, despite the forms claiming to authorize withdrawals at the beneficiary's request. He testified to invoices from a landscaping company that, according to state business records, had dissolved 4 years before the invoices were dated. He testified that the trust's official annual reports filed with the court had been altered after the fact in at least 3 instances, with numbers changed to mask the size of the withdrawals. He testified that 2 full years of required financial disclosures were simply missing from the file entirely. Not incomplete, not delayed, but absent, as though someone had hoped no one would ever go looking for them. "In my professional opinion," Delgado said, closing his folder, "this is not mismanagement. This is a sustained pattern of financial fraud." The judge didn't take long to deliberate. She didn't need to. She denied the conservatorship petition in full, calling it, in her written ruling, an attempt to weaponize the court's protective authority for personal financial gain. She removed my father as trustee effective immediately and appointed an independent, court-supervised trustee to oversee what remained of the trust. She ordered a complete forensic audit of every transaction made under his management, going back to the day my mother's parents had passed. She referred the entire case to the district attorney's office for criminal investigation, specifically citing the forged signatures and altered records. And she ordered my father to personally cover every dollar of my legal fees, calling my case one of the more clear-cut instances of financial elder-to-younger exploitation I have seen presented in this courtroom. I don't remember standing up. I remember Renata's hand on my shoulder, and I remember, distantly, my stepmother already gathering her purse, already moving toward the door, already gone before the judge had finished reading the final line of her order. The family fallout came quickly after that, the way a dam doesn't leak so much as it simply stops existing all at once. My stepmother filed for divorce 11 weeks later. Word came back to me, through a cousin who still spoke to both sides, that she'd cleaned out what remained of the joint accounts before the papers were even signed, which felt, in a strange way, like poetic justice, watching the person who helped empty one account get emptied out of another. Relatives who had sat in that courtroom nodding along to my father's story started reaching out. Some sent long emails full of apology and shame. Some just called and said they were sorry without needing to explain what for. My half-siblings, older now and old enough to look at financial records for themselves, reached out separately, both of them, in the same week, saying almost the same thing in different words. They hadn't known. They'd believed what they were told because it was easier than questioning the only father they'd ever known. I didn't hold it against them. They were children repeating a story someone else had written for them. That wasn't their fraud to answer for. My father's reputation, in the small, tightly wound community we came from, didn't survive the story once it got out. It never does. I visited my mother's grave that weekend, the way I do a few times a year, and I sat down on the grass beside the headstone the way I had 100 times before. "You always believed I was stronger than they claimed," I said, not sure if I was talking to her or to the version of myself that had needed to hear it for a decade. Today, the court finally believed it too. The wind moved through the trees above the cemetery the way it always does, indifferent and steady, and I sat there a while longer before I stood up and brushed the grass off my knees. Sometimes justice doesn't come from shouting the loudest. Sometimes it doesn't come from the best lawyer or the most sympathetic witness or the version of the story told with the most conviction. Sometimes it comes from one honest question, asked quietly, by someone who is paying closer attention than anyone in the room realized.